All right, good morning. Welcome to Ames Public Library, both in person and virtually, for Genealogy Plus, a program brought to you through a partnership with Ames Public Library and the Story County Genealogical Society. I'm Megan Klein-Hewitt, Adult Services Manager here at APL. The library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas, which we do through diverse and inclusive resources and programming like today's event. For those of us with you in person, the room is equipped with an induction loop for the benefit of hearing aid users. To use, please switch your hearing aid to T. We also have a hearing assist device that we can lend you if you're interested. For those of you with us virtually, we will be muting your microphones during the presentation, so please submit questions via the chat, which you should find a link to at either the bottom or top of your screen. We will be monitoring the chat to make sure your questions get shared with our speakers when appropriate, and there will be some time for questions at the end of the session. If you get bumped out of the Zoom meeting, just follow that original link back and you can get right back in. And we do have live captioning enabled. So if you're not seeing captions, you can turn them on by clicking the CC Live Transcript button in the Zoom menu bar and selecting closed captioning. For everyone, today's session is being recorded and will be posted to the Ames Public Library's YouTube channel after the event. And we will have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. If you're on Zoom, your questions will be read aloud by a library staff member. And if you're with us in the room, I will come around with a microphone for you to share your questions so that the folks online can hear you. And with that, please welcome Arlen and Asta Twedt.
Thank you, Megan. And thank you all for coming here and those attending by Zoom. I'd like to thank the members of the Genealogy Plus Planning Committee for inviting me to be part of your series this year. When Nancy emailed me about speaking, I told her, well, I'd really like to do something with my editor, who's also my wife. And so, you know, when people ask me about my books, I always tell them that I could not have written my books without Asta's support and her editorial assistance. And I also told Nancy that what I'd like to do is to present a program that's similar to what we see on a program that we watch called Book TV, where authors of recently published nonfiction are interviewed. So with that, I think I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you. And I want to thank you also for the invitation and for those of you who are here in person and also on Zoom. So I'm going to be interviewing Arlen, but I'm going to try to not look at him all the time, which might be a little clumsy, but I think it's probably easier to understand if I'm trying to look at you. And so with that, I'll work at that anyway. And as Megan indicated, we will leave time at the end for any questions that you might have. So, okay, I have a personal question to start with. And that is something that I've been thinking about lately. Back when I was a sweet young freshman in college, and you decided to ask me out, did you think, wow, there's someone I think would make a great editor and proofreader if I ever decided I wanted to write some books someday? Is that what attracted you to me?
No, dear. I asked you out for the Valentine's Day dance because of your charming personality.
Yeah.
Well, there might have been another reason. You remember how you had a work-study position in the cafeteria handing out milk? Maybe I thought if you liked me, you might be willing to give this thirsty farm boy, an extra carton of milk.
Yeah. Oh dear. Well, I think we better move on from that. So we started seeing each other, and as we got to know each other, you found out really soon that I was someone who had grown up 50 miles south of Duluth, Minnesota, in a Danish community, and I was 100% Danish American. And I was very familiar with my heritage, and we followed a lot of Danish traditions. But I was surprised that you, being 100% Norwegian American, didn't really know very much about your heritage, and really about the only traditions that you followed was that you did have a lot of food, like at Christmas time and so on, that was Norwegian. But one thing I do remember is that you often said you really wanted to visit Norway someday.
That's true. I remember thinking about Norway even as a child, and I think the reason for that is that my mother's parents were born in Norway and immigrated to this country in 1906 and 1910. So I was always curious about where they lived in Norway.
So we got married, and when you were out of the Air Force in 1970, we decided to use up our big savings, as you can imagine, after we had paid off our college debts, and travel in Europe. And so we bought a Volkswagen van and picked it up in Germany, and we traveled for 4 months. And so we left the Scandinavian countries until last. And I'll never forget when we entered Norway from Sweden, and you came back from the passport office to show our passports, and you had this huge grin on your face. You were so excited that you were finally in Norway, the land of your ancestors. And then I think one of the first things that we did was we bought a soft serve ice cream cone, and the first photo I have of you in Norway is with ice cream all over your face and your big red beard that you had grown by this time.
Yes, and after we visited Oslo and Bergen, we traveled about 45 miles southeast of Bergen to an area along the Hardanger Fjord where my father's ancestors had lived before they immigrated in the mid-1800s, and where my mother's parents had lived before immigrating. I talked to my grandma Tyndall about our trip, and she'd written her brother, whose name was Johan Mortweet, and so he was expecting us. But when I asked my grandma Tweet if she knew any relatives in Norway, no, she didn't know any relatives. So, but by the time we were ready to leave on the trip, my mother had found the name of someone who worked at a bank in Rosendal who could help us find Tweet ancestors.
And that led us to the Tweet family farm, where we met Amanda Skogton, who answered the door when we knocked on the farm door and invited us in the home. And we weren't in there very long before we realized that, yes, her husband, Gunnar, and Arlen descended from the same Tweet family. And so that was just terribly exciting. And she invited us to come back that evening and meet Gunnar. The only problem was that was lost in translation. I was speaking Danish, which was passable, but of course she was speaking Norwegian, and the words in Danish and Norwegian that mean this evening are not at all similar. And so I had no idea she was inviting us back that evening. And their whole family gathered. They baked a big cake, and they were expecting us for cake and coffee that evening, and we didn't show up. So, well, after that experience, we headed across the fjord, but it was a number of years later. In fact, I think it was the third visit back to visit the Tweet family that they finally told us that we were a bit late for coffee. So anyway, they forgave us. They were wonderful people, are wonderful people. And then we headed across the fjord to visit Johan Mortweet, Arlen's great uncle, who was expecting us. And he lived on the family farm there with his son and daughter-in-law and grandchildren. And we had a marvelous time visiting with them. And we have been so grateful for these connections that we have had with your family all these years, 50 some years later, that we have just enriched our whole lives.
Yeah, and meeting some of my relatives in Norway made me more curious about my ancestry. And but I really didn't start looking into my family's history until 1977, when we watched the TV miniseries Roots about Alex Haley's search for his ancestors in Africa. And then it was a few years later we decided, we would like to take our two daughters to Norway and Denmark sometime to help them learn more about their Danish and Norwegian heritage. So we decided that 1986 would be a good year to do that. They'd be 12 and 14. So that gave me a deadline to finish my family history, which I did. And my parents decided to to go to Europe that year too, because my mother had always wanted to meet her first cousin, Jens. And so we met them in Bergen, and we traveled together down to where the Tweet and the more Tweet relatives lived, and we stayed with them.
So now it's time to stop talking about our trips to Norway and begin connecting our experiences in Norway with your doing your research about Norwegians that came to Central Iowa in the mid-1800s. The title of the program that you submitted is Preserving Central Iowa's Norwegian Heritage, which is what I know motivates you in what you do all the time, is preserving this history. And it goes on to state that you will be discussing how you started writing your history, why it took you so long to write your history, and why you decided to publish these books yourself. So let's begin with the first topic. Why did you write this history?
Well, after I finished my family history in 1985, I thought I was done with family history and that sort of thing. And it was time to return to doing more wood carving, which I had been doing for a few years. But then in 1989, after we'd gotten a really wonderful, beautiful snow, I decided to go out to Saylorville Lake for a walk. And during that walk, I got to thinking about a set of my great-great-grandparents who helped start the settlement east of Story City, the Norwegian settlement in 1856. That winter of 1856, 1857 was a terrible winter for people living out here in what was the frontier country at that time. And I remember thinking about, I really hadn't found that much information about their lives when I was working on my family history. So I remember thinking, I wish somebody would write a history of the Central Iowa Norwegians so I could know more what their lives were like during that time.
So you kept on wanting to learn more, but you had really what became kind of a big barrier for you in that you didn't know anything of the Norwegian language. So trying to read some of the records and so on was impossible for you. And so you decided, you and your neighbor Stan, that you'd go to adult education classes and learn a little bit about the Norwegian language, right?
That's right, and we did. And the first class we took was in Des Moines, but then after Christmas that year, they started offering a weekly adult education class in the Norwegian language in Story City. So we started attending there. And we did that for 13 winters. And we had a lot of fun doing that. We learned some Norwegian, and we made some great friends.
We did make great friends. They were my friends too, and they were wonderful people. And I remember in 1993, they talked you into doing something that helped you learn a lot more about Norwegians coming to Iowa.
That's true. Every once in a while in class, I would talk about what I'd learned about the Norwegian immigrant settlement in Central Iowa, and I was working on my family history. Two of our classmates, Ted and Doris, were members of the Sons of Norway Lodge in Story City. And so they asked me to give a presentation at one of their meetings on the coming of the Norwegians to Central Iowa. And that's what I did.
You did a lot of research preparing for that presentation. And I think it really became a launch pad of sorts, because after that, it was when you realized that, well, maybe you could be that person to write that history of the Norwegians coming to Central Iowa that you hoped that someone would write.
And that's exactly what happened. And 2 years later, I started something called the Central Iowa Norwegian Project to begin gathering information for a history of the first 50 years of Norwegian settlement in Central Iowa.
And your goal was to have a history published in 2005, which was the 150th anniversary of the coming of the Norwegians to this area. And that didn't happen.
No, it didn't happen. When I realized there's no way I was going to have that history done by 2005, well, maybe I could have an anthology of histories and memoirs that other people have written about Norwegian settlement in Central Iowa. Maybe I could publish that in 2005. That didn't happen either. Just too much to get done when I was still working full time.
Yeah, definitely. And you loved your job, but you really had two jobs. So you ended up retiring early so that you could concentrate on research and writing. And that was in 2004. But it was still 12 years before you published your first book. So why did that take you so long to publish your first history?
Well, when I retired in 2004, I wasn't nearly as far along in my research as I thought I would be. I spent almost all of the time concentrating on learning about the 647 Norwegians who lived in Central Iowa during the first 5.5 years of settlement before the end of 1860. And putting information about them into what I call my early settler database. And then in 2000, I let Mark Christian, who's the administrator for the Story County Gen website, that those of you who do genealogy work, you're very familiar with that. I let him put my early settler database on the internet. And then for the next 3, 4, 5 years, I got lots of email from genealogists, family historians, wanting to know if I had information about this person or that person. And that kept me busy, very busy answering emails.
So by the time you retired, you really hadn't had time to concentrate on the other two goals of your project, which were to identify everything that had already been written about the Norwegian immigrants to Central Iowa and collecting stories about the settlements in the first 50 years of their settlement in Iowa.
That's true too. And after I retired, I decided the only way I was really going to learn about what life was like in the settlements was to read the Nevada newspaper up through 1905. Now, it started publication in 1857, but that led to reading newspapers for Roland, Story City, Cambridge, Slater. I did not complete my newspaper reading until 15 years later, just before I published the volume 3 of the Central Iowa Norwegians, which was a little more than a year ago now, last year.
So you're talking about 3 volumes, but when you retired in 2004, you were thinking about writing a 2-volume history. The first volume being the settlement history of the first 25 years of the Norwegians coming to this area, and the second volume being the next 25 years, which was the town building period. So tell us how your vision of this history evolved into being a 3-volume history.
Well, in 2009, I started to write what I call biographical profiles of the families, the early families that lived in Central Iowa during those first 5.5 years. And as I think back on it, I'm quite sure the idea came from attending 2 cemetery walks at the Story City, in Story City, put on by the Story City Historical Society that were very good. But that became a very time-consuming project. I wrote 145 of them, or approximately 145, and it took me 5 years to complete all those biographical profiles. So those biographical profiles and some demographic tables from my early settler database became the signature piece in volume 2 of the Central Iowa Norwegians. And
then you did have another life too. And then you also got sidetracked by some other projects. You always have lots of projects going, it seems like. But I remember one of the projects that you got sidelined with was you wrote a history of the Danes that came to Central Iowa. That was the 3rd Danish settlement in Iowa. And they settled south of Story City. It was called the Copenhagen Settlement, right?
Yes. Well, I had I read about them or discovered more information about them in the history of the congregational history for the Bethel Lutheran Church there in Story City. And what really popped out to me when I was reading the history was that they had a list of the charter members, and almost half of them were Danish immigrants. So in 2007, I think it was, I took time out and I started looking up information on the 94 Danes who were enumerated on the 1870 census living in Lafayette Township, where Story City is located. And then 4 years later, in 2011, I published a history of the Copenhagen Settlement in the Journal of the Danish American Heritage Society.
And then there was the memoir that you wrote about growing up in the 1950s on a farm. How about telling us about that too?
Well, that started when our grandson, Isaac, called. You were in California
Yes.
attending a conference. He really wanted to talk to his grandmother. But, I did the best I could to console him because his guinea pig had died and he was really a sad little boy. And I felt like I'd done an inadequate job of consoling him. So I sat down and started to write about all the pets that I had when I was his age, growing up on a farm. And well, it turned out to be quite a long essay. And then, oh, this is kind of fun. I wrote another essay. I forget which essay I did next. Well, I ended up writing 30 essays, and that was in 2012. 30 essays about growing up on a farm in the 1950s, which I gave to our daughters and grandchildren, my brother and sister, for Christmas that year.
And I think they were all addressed to dear and then the names of our grandchildren,
Yes,
right? Yeah.
right.
I think that brings us pretty much up to the work that you did until 2017 when you published your first volume of the Central Iowa Norwegians. So let's go to the next point about the process of why you decided to publish this yourself.
I really hadn't thought much about how I was going to get this history published when I started the Central Iowa Norwegian Project in 1995. A few years later, I met Peter, who had supervised a lot of the publication of a lot of local history as head of the State Historical Society in Iowa. And then he became the head of the State Historical Society in Indiana. And Peter told me, really, you're going to have a difficult time finding a publisher for a history like yours. You're probably going to need to think about publishing yourself. And in order to do that, you're going to need to, you probably need to print 400 to 500 copies. That would probably cost you around $10,000 to $15,000. So he suggested I start thinking about how I was going to raise that money to publish those books. Well, that didn't sound like I wanted to be doing. I didn't trying to raise money, and that was not what I wanted, how I wanted to be spending my time. And I also didn't want boxes of books sitting in my basement that I had to figure out how I was going to sell.
No, fundraising and selling and self-promotion are just not your thing. So, but you did end up publishing the book privately anyway. So tell us about how that happened.
Well, a couple of years before I met Peter, I'd read an article in, I believe it was a Time magazine, about a new way of publishing called print-on-demand publishing. And this type of publishing, books are not printed until somebody has ordered them. And that sounded pretty good to me. Then there were companies, print-on-demand publishing companies, that would format your book. They would design a cover for it. They would keep it on file electronically until someone ordered it, and then they would send it out to them. And so, when I told Peter about it, he wasn't familiar with that kind of publishing, but after hearing what he told me about the other way of publishing my book, I pretty much decided print-on-demand publishing was the way I was going to go.
But you still decided not to use one of those online publishing companies. So tell us how that happened.
Well, then we happened to meet Lars. Lars had worked for one of those print-on-demand publishing companies, formatting books for other people. And the way we met him is that he had formatted a book for a friend of ours. So we talked to Lars, and he says, well, when you get ready to publish volume 1, give me a call, which we did. And we had a long conversation with Lars, and during that conversation, he started asking me, well, how much do you know about Microsoft Word processing? I was pretty familiar with Microsoft Word processing. He finally says, you don't have to pay me $70 an hour to format your book. You can learn how to do this yourself. So that's exactly what we decided to do. And he also suggested someone who could design a book cover for us. So the only real cost of publishing it ourselves was, of course, the time to do that, and then paying someone to design a book cover.
So if somebody's interested in doing formatting of a book, what other kinds of tips or thoughts do you have about that?
Well, the main thing for me anyway was the self-satisfaction of having done it myself. And even more importantly, having control over the content of the book. Had I found a publisher for a book, I'm sure that the editor would have wanted me to change my outline that I'd developed before even starting the project in 1995. I wouldn't have been happy about that. As it turned out, the only editor I had to satisfy was you. And of course, I had to make changes in punctuation. You were always on my case about writing a more active voice. Sometimes you made suggestions for, changes in the organization of a section or something like that. But otherwise, I could publish it the way I wanted it. And so just let me say again, dear, that I couldn't have done this without you and your editorial assistance.
Well, thank you. And you're always very generous to tell me that. And I do appreciate that. And I don't think we really even argued when when I suggested things.
I beg your pardon, except for commas.
Oh, yeah, well, commas, there's that. But I was right, of course.
Well, you're always right.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple more points that we should discuss before we get to the audience questions. And that is, first of all, what parts of your history did you find most interesting to research and to write about?
Well, that's really an impossible question for me to answer. Because
well, I'm sorry I asked it.
I like researching and writing about everything that's in my books. So I think the best way for me to try and answer that is with the help of the brochure that the people attending here at the library received when they came in here, and those of you attending by Zoom were sent by email. The inside of that brochure contains the contents of my books. The shaded area that you see on that brochure contains what I always refer to as the signature pieces of my history. That's the settlement period history, the biographical profiles of the early families, and the town building history. And then below those signature pieces are short histories, memoirs that other people have written, and three pieces by me, one of a couple that I compiled, and then another piece that I had written. So let me try and answer your question by telling you what I found most interesting about the signature pieces in each of the volumes. The signature piece in volume 1 starts in southwestern Norway, where the Central Iowa Norwegians lived before they started immigrating to a Norwegian settlement area about 60 miles southwest of Chicago in the mid-1840s. And in 1855, some of those families decided to start a new Norwegian settlement, which they started right southwest of Key Ridge. And the next year, some other families left that settlement, and they started a second Central Iowa Norwegian settlement east of Story City. And by the end of 1880, 25 years later, Central Iowa had become the third most popular settlement area for Norwegian immigrants in Iowa. And almost all of the virgin prairie here in Central Iowa had been transformed into farms. Now, what I found most interesting about working on this volume was learning about what their life was like before the railroad train before Nevada got railroad service in 1864. On the 1860 census, there were Norwegian families enumerated in 97 dwelling houses in Story County, northern Polk County, southern Hamilton County, and in 52 of those dwelling houses, the families had lived there long enough in order to report agricultural product information on the Schedule 4 of the 1860 census. And that information was very helpful to me in learning about what life was really like for them while they were still living in what you would call a subsistence economy, and in an area on the western frontier of the United States that was still considered frontier country. Now, the signature piece in volume 2, as I said, contains my biographical profiles of the early families and some demographic tables from my early settler database. And those tables describe the year and birth of those 647 Norwegians who were living here during that time, during the early period. For those who were born in Norway, the year they immigrated, the parish they came from in Norway, and then finally the last table is about the locations of the cemeteries where they're buried. What I found most interesting and was really surprised actually about was that in writing stories or writing these profiles about each of these families became as important to me really as my own two sets of great-grandparents who had helped start the second Central Iowa Norwegian settlement east of Story City in 1856. Now the signature piece in volume 3 is my town building period or history, and it begins when new rail lines came into Central Iowa in the early 1880s and new towns were platted. And what I found most interesting about this volume is the special topics that I decided to delve into. Topics like farming and farm life, religion and church life, how they educated the next generation, what their amusements were, cultural activities were, and how their struggle to become involved in even in county politics, especially here in Story County. I think if you were to ask me which of the signature pieces is my favorite, I'd probably have to say that it was the signature piece in volume 3, because it answered so many of the questions I had when I was taking that winter walk back in 1989 and wishing someone else would write a history of the Central Iowa Norwegians.
I just want to interject another thing that I know was really important to you, and that you just loved researching and writing about, and that was the interactions that you discovered between the Miswaki Indians and the early settlers.
That's true. During my research, I've found many references to the pioneers, settlers meeting, seeing Miswaki Indians near the Skunk River, which is where these two settlements were located. And when I told the tribal historian from the Miswaki settlement, Jonathan Buffalo, about these references, he encouraged me to write about them. And I told Jonathan, you know, I don't understand your culture. I don't understand your traditions. I just don't feel comfortable doing that. But a few years later, I decided, you know, let's try. So I did write a piece about the Miswaki Indians, and it's the last piece in volume 2 about the Euro-American interaction with Miswaki Indians. When the U.S. federal government opened land for settlement here in Central Iowa in the late 1840s, there had been actually 2 Indian tribes living in Central Iowa before European settlers started settling here. One was the Miswaki tribe, and the other was the Sauk tribe. Well, in the fall of 1846, the federal government relocated those two tribes to a reservation in Kansas in accordance with a treaty that they had signed in 1842. Some of the Miswaki were very unhappy there. They really wanted to get back to their living in their permanent settlement location here in Central Iowa, which is along the Iowa River in Tama County. And they actually found somebody who would sell land to them, but Native Americans at that time were not considered citizens of the United States, so they could not legally purchase land. The governor, in 1857, the governor of Iowa got behind their cause and helped them purchase their first 80 acres in Tama County. And once they started moving back there, they resumed their former lifestyle, which meant planting their corn, their squash, their beans there at their permanent settlement area. And then after harvest in the fall, they would families would move east and west of the Iowa River to smaller rivers and creeks. One of their favorite rivers was the Skunk River, and there they would hunt and trap all winter, and they would stay until they'd harvested their annual supply of maple syrup, and then they would head back to Tama County to prepare their fields for planting their next year's crop. So yes, I've found many references to them over the years. They continued to live this kind of lifestyle until after the turn of the century. So people living in the Central Iowa saw a lot of the Miswaki Indians.
And I know you were concerned about how Jonathan Buffalo, you were nervous about writing this since you said you didn't understand their culture, but you were pleased when Jonathan Buffalo was happy with what you had
Yes,
written.
I was.
Yeah,
He was pleased. I found out he was pleased that I had written about it.
yeah. So you finished writing volume 3, well, a year ago now, and it was during the pandemic before vaccinations. And you definitely had COVID fatigue, like we all did, right? And you also had book writing fatigue, I think, too, because one of the things that told me that was that you did a lot of just pleasure reading last winter. And then when spring came, you were outside and you did, lots of projects in our backyard and with our garden and so on. And you were busy that way, but I know you, and I knew it was just a matter of time before you'd be back at the research and writing again, and you are. So tell us what you're up to now.
Well, that was actually your idea, so why don't you tell them about what's up next?
Okay, well, it sounds a little strange because it sounds like I'm pushing you to write volume 4, but I'm not really. But it is another book. And you had a lot of things written in your those first 3 volumes that you would have liked to have included, but you kind of tried to stick to the 350 pages or something like that. And so there were some things that there just weren't room for, like some historical talks you had given or some specific articles you had written. And I know there were some things that my mother had translated for you from the newspaper, and you would have liked to have published those. So I thought you should write a book of leftovers. So I think that's what's happening.
Yes, and when I sat down and made a list of those leftovers, as you call them, there was still going to be room in a book, like you say, my books are normally around 350 pages, maybe a little bit more. And so I've always been interested in a couple of the 2 most prominent Norwegian politicians in the late 19th century, early 20th century. One of them was by a man by the name of Ole Nelson, who was a businessman in Slater. And another was Ole Rowe, who was the Story County superintendent of schools for 10 years in the 1880s. So, and both of them earned the right to be addressed as the Honorable Ole Nelson and the Honorable Ole Rowe. So those biographies is what I'm going to be working on this winter.
And when you finish that book, I know you're you used to always have other projects, but one of the things you've kind of been working on off and on through the years is a history of the area of where you grew up in your old neighborhood.
Yes, I grew up 4 miles south of Roland in Milford Township. My father was actually born on the farm I grew up on. My mother was born in a farmhouse about 1.5 miles west of there. And I published a biography about their lives in my family history in 1985, but then in the early 90s, I started interviewing them again. I have about 20 hours of tape about their lives in that neighborhood. So what I have in mind is to live long enough and stay healthy long enough that to write a history, not just of the neighborhood, but there in Milford Township, but Norwegian settlement in Milford Township, which basically occurred in the northern half of the township. They started settling there in 1865, and so hopefully I can get to that someday.
So before the pandemic, your home away from home was the State Historical Library down in Des Moines, and I kind of sense that you're going to be back down there again, right?
Well, I think you can count on that. I hope I can be like George Mills.
Yeah.
George Mills was the political writer for the Des Moines Register for 30 years before he retired at age 70. And then he started doing some reporting on WHO TV, and he continued to write books about Iowa history. And I can still remember seeing him down there one Saturday. He was in his 90s at that time, wasn't walking very well. And I had his still dressed as he was going to work at the Des Moines Register, he had a suit coat on, he didn't have a tie on, but and he was shuffling back from the cabinets that contain all the microfilm of newspapers and going up to, and I watched him sit down at a microfilm reader and put the roll of microfilm on and start looking for something. I don't know, but I hope that's me someday.
I hope so too. So now let's see what kinds of questions that the audience might have. Megan indicated that she had a microphone for any of you that might like to ask questions here, and also she's going to be monitoring the chat questions.
You had mentioned the Tweet name. Was that a patronymic name, or do you know if it had a different, if it was slightly different in Norway?
Well, it's an Americanized spelling of the Tweet name, and it's a farm name. Tvedt, T-V-E-D-T. Well, the new Norwegian spelling is T-V-E-I-T, which means newly cultivated land. And just as an aside, I mentioned that my grandmother, my mother's mother, we visited her brother Johan Twedt, or more Twedt. Well, that just meant more newly cultivated land. So it's a Norwegian farm name that's been kind of just changed slightly in terms of spelling.
So there could be a number of tweets, that are not related at all, Looks like you knew that answer already, probably.
I'm glad to hear you're writing about Milford. That's where my husband's family's from.
Could you speak a little louder?
I said my husband's family is from Milford.
Okay.
So I just want to know, you're going to write about the Jacobsons.
Are you going to write about the
I
Can you
don't
write
know
about the
what
neighbors?
I'm going to write about. Certainly, the Jacobson family was in my neighborhood. So, and Irene Jacobson, I assume was one of your husband's relatives, wrote a wonderful family history that's in the, I don't know if it's in, I think it's in the Ames Library here. I know it's in the Story City Library called, I believe it's called Life in the Middle Lane. So I'm sure I'll be referring to that family history when I start working on my Milford Township history.
Another question, you probably have file cabinets full of information that you've collected for your books.
Oh, thank you for that question.
Do you have a
Yes,
plan?
I do.
Do you have a plan for all of that? For
I
all the
have,
information collected?
Oh, do I have a plan for it?
What happens to?
What's going to happen to it? I'm not sure. You know, I asked somebody one time, a man we met on one of our trips, who had been the head of the Newark, New Jersey library system. I asked him, what should I do with that? Well, he says, you know, really, today you really need to digitize it. You know, make it available. Well, I don't have a lot of original documents. Most of I've spent a lot of money copying materials, and they're 25 cents a piece down at the State Historical Library. So hundreds of dollars I spent down there. I don't honestly know. I wish I could give you an answer, but I don't know.
Thank you.
In your travels, I would assume that over to Norway, that you met some of your relatives. Were you surprised of some that you didn't know about? And that furthered your research into other areas of your family?
You know, really, my relatives in Norway, we have just enjoyed developing those relationships. In fact, we just FaceTimed with a cousin in Trondheim here, was it a couple of days ago? Yesterday. But what I learned when I started into family history was that, you know, how you start building this family chart, you know, and you try and work it all the way back as far back as you can, which you can work it all quite a ways back in Norway, because there's a lot, there's books called Bygde books that contain information about the church. They're really written from church records that go back to the early 1600s. But what I learned is that while doing family history, I was most interested in my Norwegian American ancestors. So that's really what I concentrated on in my family history. I do have information because Asta mentioned that my relative Gunnar that we met in 1970, he sent me a wonderful.
We didn't
chart.
meet him.
No, we didn't.
We
meet him.
tried to.
We met
They
him.
tried to get us to
We
meet
actually
him.
met him in 1982 when he and his wife Amanda came over here on a tour group to visit Central Iowa. That was the first time we met Gunnar. But no, I really don't. I haven't concentrated on that. So I don't even have I've only just dealt with direct ancestors. I don't have a genealogy program. Like Asta said, we cherish the relationships we've developed with friends, with relatives, and actually friends in Norway. When we go to Norway, we can only stay for 30 days. We tell people, okay, they want you to stay for a long time. We can stay 3 nights because we have so many people to visit. So, yeah.
Well, I'd like to just add one thing, though, that I think one thing that's been so interesting is that they have just taken us in and how much they consider their American family their family too. Yes. And that's just been really heartwarming for us. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Are you going to do any, or have you done any Danish research on your side of the family?
You know, I really haven't very much. I know where all of my one grandmother was born in Denmark, but otherwise it was all my great grandparents. And I know where all of my great grandparents were born, and I have visited. Well, one of the places I have not visited, but otherwise they were born in all over in Denmark, and like 3 different islands, and the peninsula of Jutland and the well, I guess Sjælland is where Copenhagen is in, is also an island. So they were all different places in Denmark where they were born. I have visited those places, but I don't know farther back because my family really didn't keep contact with their relatives back in Denmark, because most of them immigrated. And so, yeah, I really haven't. When I go to, I did attend a school in Denmark, and so when I go to Denmark, I visit friends from that time. But I've also had the opportunity to feel like I've connected some with my family by visiting those places where my great grandparents were born. Thank you. Okay. Well,
Arlen?
if you think of any questions, or if you who are doing Zoom think of any questions at any time, Arlen's always happy to answer questions by email. And so, feel free to correspond with him. His email is on the brochure that you got at atweet@aol.com. And so just go ahead and email him. And if you have any questions about his books, they're on Amazon, and you can kind of see what they're like by looking there. He didn't bring any along today. So, Arlen, after all these years of doing this research, you never have lost your enthusiasm and your passion for researching and writing and learning more about local history. So what keeps you going?
Well, one thing that keeps me going is that I've always been a project type person. I love having projects to work on. I love having projects to think about. And I've always liked research. I've always liked writing. And quite honestly, I can't think of, for me, preserving the Norwegian heritage of Central Iowa has become, I won't say an obsession, but certainly a passion for me. But I think another thing that keeps me going is a historian I learned about when I was first a local historian. I learned about when I started researching my family's history in 1975. His name is Julian McFarland. He wrote a wonderful history about Central Iowa. The title of the book is, I believe, the history of the Norwegian, the history of the pioneer era on the Iowa prairies. And I still remember how excited I was to find that book back in 1977. If the McFarland name sounds interesting to you or familiar to you, it's because Julian McFarland, his father, his brother, and 2 other doctors started the McFarland Clinic here in Ames, Iowa. That's just a few blocks from the library. Julian McFarland died in 1969. And in a tribute to him, the editor of the Ames newspaper wrote, "His hallmark was a deep and abiding curiosity about any projects in which he became interested." And as one of several examples, the editor stated, one of his activities in retirement had been an intensive interest in the Central Iowa area, and he had, as a hobby, investigated every corner of Story and adjoining counties. So I think you can see why Julian McFarland has been an inspiration for me all these years. I identify with his sense of curiosity. And my hope is that people who are interested in the Norwegian immigrant settlement in Central Iowa will be as excited to find his book, find my books on a library shelf as I was back in 1977 when I found his book on a library shelf in this very library.
So thank you for inviting us to the Genealogy Plus series, and thanks for all of you who are attending and for your good questions and your interest. So I have to end with, Arlen, you're always so generous about thanking me. You did it again today, but I never thank you enough for everything that you've done. I really admire you for everything you've done to preserve the history, this important history of the Norwegians coming to Central Iowa. So thanks again, everybody.
What can you tell us about the name changes that frequently took place at immigration?
What was that question?
The name changes that took place at immigration?
Well,
Oh, there weren't any, right?
a lot of the Norwegians here in Central Iowa did keep their farm names, but some of them, I talked to someone this morning, mentioned Jacobson. Well, Jacobson actually is a Christian name, means the son of Jacob. Or talked to someone earlier before we started, Thompson, the son of Thomas, or probably. So some of them dropped the farm. They did not use a farm name. They used their Christian name. Now, I'm sure you've also heard stories that people who immigrated later came to Ellis Island, their name got changed by who was ever recording it in the records there at Ellis Island. So, and sometimes they got changed into some very unusual names that seem to have no relationship to either their father's name or the farm they came from or whatever. So, but a lot of Norwegians, at least not just here in Central Iowa, did keep their farm name. Now, I will tell you another interesting story of my own family. My father's parents were second cousins. So I have two sets of great-great-grandparents, two great-great-grandfathers who were brothers that came from the Tweet or Tveit farm in Norway. And there were actually three brothers and two sisters that immigrated from that farm. Two other brothers stayed back on the farm, but those five siblings all settled around the Roland area. Two of them kept the farm name, but Knut, he got tired of being mixed up with all the other Tweets around, so he dropped the
Leroy
farm
knows
name,
this story.
and he decided to go with his Christian name, which was Johnson. Now figure that one out. I would think there were more Johnsons than there were Tweets around here at that time, but it's that's an interesting thing you find out in family history about just how did you end up with the name that you have.
Thank you.
Yeah. It probably does confuse a lot of people. All of you who are doing genealogy have probably been confused by that a lot.
Well, you're using the term farm name, and maybe I should know the answer to that, but can you explain what you mean by farm name?
Yes, all the farms at the time of immigration in the 1800s, and all the farms have a name. Sometimes they were named because of well, like I said, Tweet, newly cultivated land. So someone started farming that little foothill. We're talking about southwestern Norway, so we're talking about farming on the foothills of mountains alongside fjords, and farming, it's not like it is here in Iowa. I mean, it's not very productive land, and they had to make their living. Some of them also did a lot of fishing to supplement their income for their livelihood. But these are small farms. They each have a name. And what's interesting about Norway, and I don't know about other countries, is that if you moved from one farm to another, you picked up the name of that farm. So Helvik is a farm right next to the Tweet farm. And Helvik, Helvik, is a name that got Americanized to Helvig, Helvig. You have Helvig families that settle here in Central Iowa. But like I say, if you move from one farm to the next, you kept your Christian name. So if your name was, if you're Christian, if you were the son of Jacob, Jacobson, you kept your Christian name. But if you moved to a different farm, then you picked up a different farm name. And all the church records in Norway were organized or kept according to the farm that you lived on. And in the church records, if you look at the church records, there'll be a section of the church records that says, "Oh, this family moved from the Twedt farm to the Helvik farm, and now their last name became Helvik," or whatever farm they moved to. Does that answer your question? Is that true in all Scandinavian countries? You know, I really can't tell you. I can't answer that question. I'm knowledgeable about, Norwegian history and customs and traditions and so forth, but not the other Scandinavian countries. So I know you have Swedish background, but I'm sure there's some Swedish genealogist who can answer that question for you.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.